Hello and welcome to Securities Lending Saturday. I'm Roy Zimmerhansl. I'm your host. And today we're going to be doing a review of the panel on regulatory reporting and transparency at the recent Securities Finance Technology Symposium. I think it was the 19th of May. So this is part two of this series. So it looks like it's going to be longer than I thought it was. So if securities lending is your thing, if you are a lender, a borrower, an intermediary, part of the infrastructure, or just plain interested, then this is the place for you. So let's get started. Hi, I'm Roy. I think Zimmerhansl still. Yes. Welcome to another Saturday. I was planning on covering a couple of the other panel sessions from the recent Securities Finance Technology Symposium. But to be honest with you, there was so much meat in the reg reporting and transparency section that I decided to do one on its own. Last week, I did the panel that I moderated, which was on liquidity and trading. There's still three other panels. Hopefully, I'll do that in the next week, 2 weeks, maybe even 3 weeks. We'll see how that goes. So I've reviewed the material. I have my own comments, and I will share those with you. So we'll be talking about one of the key things, which is the regulatory environment and infrastructure, particularly with a focus on reporting and transparency. Hopefully you can see the screen from my deck. So regs, reporting, and transparency. This is part two of the series, and let's just get straight into it. This is what we've been talking about. This is week 48. So we are almost, in fact, I think calendar-wise, I have been doing these shows for a year now. So thank you, everyone that has watched at any time in the past, live or on replay. Really appreciate it. I do this to share my thoughts and views as securities lending continues to spread around. Next week, I will continue with the series. I haven't put which panels I'm covering because I won't really know that until I see how much there is in each panel. Again, I thought I would cover two of them today, but the regs and reporting one was just, there was so much to it. I thought it would make sense just to focus on this one. Okay, this is what we're going to be talking about, really answering 4 questions. First of all, they went through a bit of a scene setting just to put a context around this. And then we'll go into SFTR, which has been the big regulation over recent years. Then the SEC 10C1, which is the next big pending regulation, some commentary that they gave us on other regulations, and then just a recap of what's next. So that's what we'll be talking about. Those are really the key points that were brought out in the panel session. This was the panel. It was led by Sarah Nicholson. Sarah is an expert in the business, has been around. I hope she doesn't mind this, but she's been around a very long time as a beneficial owner and as a consultant and as a trainer. So Sarah really knows her stuff. Ed Oliver, again, a longtime veteran of the industry. I've had quite a lot to do with Ed and Sarah, as a matter of fact, over many years. Again, quality panel. Gary Plummer, I actually worked with Gary probably 30 plus years ago, when it was Chase Manhattan Bank. Gary was an expert then. He's moved into securities finance since then for a number of years and is now part of the product management team at JP Morgan, expert on that. And someone I don't know, Fabien Romero from S&P Global Market Intelligence. I don't know Fabien, but he certainly had quite a lot to say and is quite knowledgeable on the topic. So I hope to get to know him in the future. So that's the panel. That's what we'll be talking about. Look, if these videos are helpful to you, please give us a thumbs up in whichever platform you're watching this on. If you want to be advised of future videos of mine, hit the subscribe button. And if you hit the bell, then you'll also be notified each and every time a video comes out. So that's the plan today. But we've someone on LinkedIn. It's such a frustrating thing. LinkedIn doesn't tell me who's actually on these things. So thank you for whoever said that. Let me just show that. There you go. Good morning. Still the one, the only Harzed. Always much appreciated. Can you imagine if there were two? God, I don't think that would be a good thing. But thank you. So let's just get into it. In the scene setting, that was really Sarah handed it over to Fabien. I think the chart itself is self-explanatory. I think one of his key points is that this isn't a new phenomenon, right? The regulatory reporting requirement or transparency or a deeper insight from regulators really goes back, particularly in Europe, to MiFID in 2007. And you can see it's been heavily sort of European focused. There's some interesting comments later with MiFID 2, and then the big one, which is SFTR. But also, you can see there's various regulations from the US, Singapore, these ones from, and then we have Japan, Australia, and then interestingly, the EMIR and SFTR. And the key point there is these are diverging and have diverged to an extent. So, look, it's not new. And for the existing regulations, the regular process and a sensible one is a review and with subsequent rewrites and refits. So we actually see the CFTC rewrite and so there and SFTR refits coming up in the coming years. Good that regulators are willing and able to go back and review the regulations, adjust and adapt to things that aren't necessary, to add in things that will actually be more meaningful to regulators and create a safer and more effective environment. And that kind of ongoing industry engagement is always a good thing. So that's rewrites, refits, and sometimes that means even additional requirements. But of course, there's always going to be new regulations coming in. That is going to be a forever thing. The days of securities finance missing out on regulation, I think, are long past us. So look, the big dog is the Securities Finance Transaction Reporting Regulation, SFTR. That's been in place now for 2-ish years. I pulled out some of the comments from the people here, and just for the rest of the slides, where I have a square box outlined, it means that to me, these are some of the key takeaways from it. But look, I think if we go back to EMIR, that regulation, let me just put it back onto the time frame here. Back here, 2014. Look, that was the really major all-encompassing regulation for the reporting side. So MiFID has some reporting elements to it as well, but also had other aspects covered within MiFID. But EMIR was the big dog on regulations. And look, to be fair, it was the first had one of these massive implementations. And I think it would be safe to say that it wasn't an immediate and huge success. It has taken some time, and quite a lot of people have learned from that. But the interesting thing is we've all learned a lot of lessons. In some cases, the teams that had been working on EMIR were moved into SR teams, and in some cases, there were new teams that were added. But I think there were a lot of things learned from things that went well and things that didn't go so well. And interestingly, after 8 years, the matching and pair rates on EMIR match the SFTR ones, which is a 2-year-old regulation in the increment of 60%. So you can see that SFTR in that sense has benefited from EMIR, but has delivered a much more successful outcome more quickly. I think the interesting thing was there was a lot of comments, and remember, these are all comments from the panelists or Sarah as the moderator. So I'm just extracting the key points that I see. I have a few of my own thoughts and views on this, which I will definitely share with you. And remember, with any of these panel sessions, you can always go back. I think you can still register even if you didn't attend live and see the replay. So if any of these topics grab your attention, I encourage you to go back to the session and register for it and hopefully see it on replay. We'll put links to it in the show notes. Remember, as always, the show notes are available on Sunday, so tomorrow at 3 p.m. UK, and you can see it at any time after that on my YouTube channel, which I will just quickly throw up the YouTube channel. there it is. If you don't want to write that down or don't have time to write that down, just go on to YouTube and look up my name, and you'll find the channel from there. So, lessons from Amir. I think there's no question that whether you are a regulator, an intermediary in the business, or a beneficial owner, the reality is there's been a huge attention to the detail on the incremental information been provided that is available now. Look, I've said all the way along that the really big winners out of SFTR are two of them. There's two winners out of SFTR to date, and apologies to those of you who have heard me say that. First of all, I think every firm that's reporting information knows more about their business today than they did before SFTR. It isn't something that I expected. I didn't really think it through, but there's no question that all the firms in the business that have SFTR reporting requirements know more about the makeup of their business, and some have changed their business practices as a result. So that was one big set of winners. The other, as I've said, is the supercomputer salespeople who have sold supercomputers to all the regulators who have to crunch all of this data. Whether they know what to do with it or not is another question, which I'll come to in a minute. But look, I think that one of the key messages that panel session was that beneficial owners are actively involved in asking questions and trying to find out information. So if you see in this box here, I think both Gary and Ed talked about the customers coming to them with questions recently, and probably on an ongoing basis now, about clients, about oversight, about the information that's available in their reporting, and asking questions about the business. So one of the points I think Ed made was that in response to a question from Sarah, was that Sarah had asked, is this new? And really, Ed's comment was clients have continuously over time expanded what they want to know about, right? In the old days, people just wanted to get, all they cared about was how much money they made. And then they needed to learn little bit more about what their exposures were, about what their collateral was. And in one of the, many collateral crises that there have been over time on reinvestments in the Lehman default. So clients have increased their need and demand for information. And I think so that's an evolving thing. And that was Ed's point. So I don't think that there's been anything new as such in terms of them asking for more information. And I think they talked about that the biggest clients have been getting just data dumps for a long time. And it was a question about fancy reports and portals that clients can access. And I'll tell you, in my whole career, I loved looking at all the stuff that we showed to clients in the different companies I've worked at. But I got to tell you, very few of them ever used it. The reality is they have their own way of working. And as much as we tried to provide them with more data and pretty graphs and things, I think that was more marketing to show what you could do if you wanted to do it. At the end of the day, clients are going to do whatever they want to do rather than be spoon-fed, I think, canned reports. So the client sophistication and demands are going, but I think there was a very clear explanation that clients did actually start to get engaged more on sort of the counterparty side of things to look at mismatches and errors and reporting times and try to ask questions about, is this normal? Is this usual? Is this borrower or that borrower, are they actually a problem because of their figures? And look, while they were both correct, the reality is Ed and Gary kind of said, look, this SFTR is a beneficial owner reporting obligation without a shadow of a doubt. The regulatory side of things says that's who's responsible for, whether they perform it themselves or they outsource to another provider. It is a client obligation. But the thing that surprised me, and the thing that I really would take issue with on the comments, is that I would expect an agent to already aggressively managing the borrower side of things. If that borrower is operationally inefficient, I would have already expected that they'd be getting docked. So I assume that has already been happening at both the firms that were talked about here, and that this is another layer on top of it. Like, I've always tried to be a little bit more aggressive with my case to actually say, if you can't cut the mustard in terms of the post-trade execution side of things, then maybe I don't want to deal with you so much. But fair dues, it is a client obligation and a client exposure. Remember, the clients are the ones that are legally exposed, whether they have an indemnification of some type or not. The reality is, not to have to rely on an indemnification. You want to be dealing with firms that are efficient and solvent, and sometimes operational problems are an indicator of trouble ahead. There was some talk about common issues like legal entity identifiers being missing, and look, that's an ongoing issue. Really, and again, I keep arguing this, outside the control of the securities finance industry, but somehow regulators have trouble accepting that. Sarah talked about the ESMA SFTR report and really identifying that more resources and focus is required from some of the national competent authorities, the regulators, to actually spend more time examining, analyzing, and maybe taking action on the data they're getting, looking at things like reporting times, looking for outliers. I think Fabien talked about trying to identify outliers to highlight potential risk, and the huge divergence in some cases between reporting times, frequency, and problems. So I think, look, I applaud ESMA for identifying that. As I said before, that's no surprise to me, because the regulators that are engaged and understand the business and which ones don't really have the knowledge, experience, or the people in-house to do that. Good that ESMA has identified that. Hopefully they will take some action on that. And the key thing here, which I thought was a really strong point from the panel, was that if regulators are engaged with the business, understand it from the data, and there's transparency for them, then maybe that provides a really strong foundation for future regulatory engagement. Look at changing and tweaking regulations that maybe people think are doing something effective, but you can demonstrate with data that they aren't really helping. And an example was UCITS. The UCITS, to me, are disadvantaged versus similar funds from other regions. I've never had a problem with that. If Europeans want to disadvantage their funds, that's a choice. But there's no question that those funds are less able to compete with similar funds in other jurisdictions. And so hopefully this sort of data transparency will give a platform for better understanding and maybe a little bit of loosening of the regulations over time. And then the final point is one of the big themes was divergence. And we've seen the UK diverge from the EU regulations on a couple of things. Like, that's a trend. The real question will be, is the divergence and the difference in regulations, is that causing problems is that adding other layers of regulation? And if so, I guess you don't have any choice. Maybe you can shift your business one direction or the other. But also, are the regulators listening to what the industry is saying about what is beneficial and what isn't beneficial in terms of data? And the more the regulators understand the data, the more likely they are to make sensible decisions. So we know some of the things the UK has dropped are beneficial in the sense that need to be reported. They don't add any value, and it makes it better for market participants. On a few UK items, not just SFTR, but other regulations, we can see that the UKers are doing a good job making it easier for businesses in the finance area without sacrificing any regulatory control. Sonia, thanks for your question. I'll be coming to that briefly in a couple of minutes. So I will talk about the reporting that's coming up. Okay, so SFTR. If we look at the next one, this is the big dog that is pending. If you just hold on, we're going to do the non-sponsored Coca-Cola break. Okay, I'm back. So it's the Securities Exchange Commission in the U.S. It's proposed regulation 10C1. Just up in the upper left, it's really a summary. So it's a one-sided report. Lenders, so a definition of what lenders are, have to report securities lending transactions to a regulated entity. That entity is likely FINRA, and which is more of a broker association rather than one that would necessarily cover agent lenders, which brings its own issues. But the summary is, look, there'll be transactions and modifications to those transactions that'll be reported and published, aggregated and aggregated on loan positions. And I'll come to whether I think all that's helpful or not in a moment. Look, I guess the question Sarah posed is, look, is this more straightforward than SFTR? And I guess in the sense is, first of all, there's fewer fields that need to be reported. So that definitely makes it easier for market participants. Secondly, it's one-sided. So the lender reports it. And so it doesn't bring about this whole sort of additional challenge of matching and pairing. That is both a good in the sense that it is easier to implement and faster to implement. It's somewhat less good that if you say, look, the whole value of the information is about having a risk or a better risk understanding of the business, then without that reconciliation, without the two-sided report saying that both sides of the transaction agree on what their exposures are, I wonder what value is. But certainly, I guess maybe some information is better than none. So in a sense, it's more straightforward. But even that, you can't really say, because I think everyone made the point that there's just a lot more clarity required in terms of what that actually means. So there's been proposals out there. It's been in consultation. But as I think Gary said, the devil is in the detail. And one of the examples that he gave is that as it's identified, you actually have to report within 15 minutes of the transaction. And the example Gary gave was that's just not how the business model works. That in many cases, the collateral isn't identified and isn't allocated within 15 minutes of the trade. It could be until the end of the day when the actual final allocations get made. And so you have something that is a practice or a reporting requirement that might work in some markets. And I think Sarah described it as often in secondary market tradings, you can see that this thing might happen. And maybe an example of that might be foreign exchange trades where you have a bulk foreign exchange transaction made and then allocated to underlying clients and reported accordingly. So that might be an example. But look, this doesn't really fit for the significant business. And so I think one of the things everyone stressed is that there is an expectation that there will have to be quite a lot of engagement with the regulators as it goes forward to try and make something that's actually sensible and workable, and in fact, even possible. So clarity is needed. And I think, again, everyone feels quite rightly proud of the strong industry track record in terms of the implementation of SFTR, led by the trade associations who did an outstanding job shepherding everyone together. And I think that's what was missing in EMIR, right? That as prevalent as it was for securities finance in sort of the repo space and securities lending space. Definitely industry associations leading the organizations that are the member and a much stronger outcome. I think everyone feels pretty confident that they can constructively engage with regulators to make any rules better and more effective. One of the questions is, though, if the agent lenders are going to have to be reporting, and they have to report to what is effectively a broker-dealer organization, that's a strange and odd fit. And it also presents challenges when giving some of this data to those people that might be counterparties of yours as a business. I think that's a really uncomfortable fit. I certainly wouldn't want to be saying, yeah, I'm sharing all of my data on my on-loan positions and availability to any broker dealer, any one broker dealer. It just doesn't make sense. And so that's for me is a huge issue. But look, the biggest issue for me is the concern over the validity of this aggregated data, anything that gets transmitted, right? Because this is a commercial business, right? The prices people pay to borrow and lend depend on multitudes of different factors. If it's a hedge fund, it's about the nature of that hedge fund and the services their prime broker provides to them and the economics of that, which may or may not include commission recognition or payment for research. There's lots of different factors that go into that price. And relationships between two counterparties. And in SFTR, a minute ago, we were just talking about looking at your counterparties and determining whether you want to deal with a counterparty because of their inefficiency. And maybe you might charge a different price for an inefficient counterparty. Now, all of a sudden, that's going to get reported. To me, that would be a misleading factor because it might not be a market rate. It might be the rate you would be willing to deal with that counterparty at, not really a reflective of the supply demand economics of a given transaction. Not all the availability is going to be available to everyone. So if it shows that there's 1 million shares in the market, that's great, except if you are not able to borrow from any of the beneficial owners that make those securities available. So you might think there's availability there, but there isn't. And the same with on loan positions. There are many different reasons for trades to happen, many different structures, and all different economic factors in there. So I think that while it's well intentioned, I just don't get the practical output of what they're expecting to do. But no one cares what I say. I think, frankly, it'll be a mess at the end of the day. But that's what I think. So a lot more information is going to be needed. Hopefully, the regulators will permit time for quite a lot of industry engagement because I think people will have a lot about it and a lot of really useful things to say about how to make it a better regulation. But don't kid yourself. Some regulation is coming. And usually when you get to the stage of something being printed in a consultation, that's about 90% of the regulation that ends up being printed. They make tweaks at the edges, but they don't make any fundamental changes really. Sometimes they do, but not often. And then they just did a recap of other regulations. One of the key points again was the global and regional divergence, because the reality is as more countries and more regions try to implement more obligatory reporting, increased transparency, those sorts of things, you're going to get regimes that diverge. They want more information, they want less information. The SE rule is going to be from SFTR in terms of who reports, how it gets reported, to whom it gets reported, and likely the amount of information as well. So that's the two of the biggest regions. Asia is not a region as such, other than in geography terms. It's a series of countries that all have their own individual regulatory environments and needs and expectations and priorities. So I think this will become more challenging. One of the interesting things, I think, you know what, and I can't remember who said this, but I think this is a paraphrase. If you can satisfy the European regulations, you can probably meet any other regulatory requirements. I think that's a good watchword. And look, again, on a more positive note, I think those firms that implemented SFTR, many firms said, actually, this has turned to be such a useful exercise for understanding our business better. Even if we don't have to report it to regulators, we should try to find all of that information for all of our trades in this activity, and really from management purposes, if nothing else, be able to aggregate that data and look at our business as a global whole. So I think if Europeans have the most demanding regime and you can satisfy that, then it does make sense to me that you should be able to meet the elsewhere. One of the examples that was given was the FCA removing the best execution or amending best execution requirements. Look, for me, for securities lending, I've never understood best execution in securities lending. This isn't a trade execution where you can say the price range was from here to here in a day. You got executed at a certain point in that. And was that an appropriate price for the size, the timing, and the trend at that time? That's a one-off snapshot. Best execution can't apply to securities lending because it also involves credit decisions, which vary over time. It creates an exposure, and ongoing exposure, not at a certain point in time. As I said, if Lehman Brothers was paying you the highest fees for all of the stock and then went out of business, it would be best execution until it wasn't. So I feel very strongly about that kind of thing. And so I think anything that moves the regulatory needle along those lines, and some smart regulators along the way go, is this regulation really important? And apply that across that whole plethora of regulations, I think that'll be a really positive outcome. And so an example of the EMIR refit, there's going to be 40% more fields. It's going to cross the 200 mark, which makes it even more ambitious in terms of data than SFTR. Europeans outdoing Europeans. I'll leave you to contemplate that yourself. One of the other things, which is a positive, is there'll be more counterparty data. So that's a good thing, because if regulators are using this information correctly and firms themselves using information correctly, it should help them manage their risk exposures and understand the better. And also another positive about it will be, as I understand it, so I'm not an expert on this, but as I understand it, there's also more specific fields for cryptocurrencies. I think that was one of Fabien's points. And again, that's a sensible thing to be doing. All quite good. And the final thing was just to wrap up what's next. There's no question that we talk about SEC 10C1. That's what's on everyone's mind. Market, new regulations. So that's what's in the front of house. And look, quite a lot of discussion about, could you ever have unified regulatory reporting? The answer to that is no, in my opinion, because first of all, as I said, different regulators have different desire, needs, capabilities, and volumes of activity for the entities that they regulate. So you wouldn't expect a smaller country where there's very little securities finance activity to need as much as in Europe or the UK or the US or Canada, Japan, whatever. So you can see that there is, as needs dictate, that will. But look at the other thing, just practically, no regulator is going to copy a regulation from another regulator, because everyone has to show value in their own operations and their own job functions. No one's just going to duplicate that. That's just not in human nature. So that's a pipe dream. But look, the truth is, this provides or creates a technology challenge for the firms, because you have to have these massive data lakes with the ability to report on a customized basis, regulator by regulator, and that takes time and money. But look, it should provide a payback, right? It should provide a payback in terms of managing your own business, servicing your customers. And of course, you don't have any choice except to meet your regulatory requirements. But the interesting thing was, there was still a strong feeling that there's two data sets here. One is, what are you reporting to your regulator to meet their requirements? And then separately, in your day-to-day business, or you have your regular reconciliations that you need to perform. And look, that's been going on for decades. We've had post-trade reconciliations that have been evolving over time. And so you've got this whole infrastructure process and technology supporting that. But of course, you're talking about two versions of the same data. And if you could bring those two together and make that part of your ongoing business activity, that's definitely a win-win. And even from a regulatory point of view, I think it'd be really odd if they over time would say, you have this set of books for reporting to us, but the business, the trades that you actually do, are actually, you have different data used to reconcile your counterparties. How does that work? That would be like we have our books that satisfy accounting regulations, but then we have the real money books for the business. There's a comment here from Sonia. There's more than 250 data points in a Solvency II data cube. This is a real issue of data management, not moving between business lines. Well, look, I'm not aware of that. That's really, I'm just going to flash that up, because I think that's fascinating. The whole Solvency II thing, I think, is interesting. The insurance companies and the way that they're regulated, I think, and reported on, I think, is an art and a science in its own. Sonia, I'd be interested in hearing more about that sometime. So maybe we can have a catch up, and maybe I can go back to one of my Wednesday live shows again. I haven't done that for a very long time. Thanks for sharing. Be interested in hearing more about that in future. So look, for what's next, the reality is, there one reporting capability to rule them all? I think that would be a precious thing indeed, but I think a difficult one to find. But it's important to have dreams. It's important to have dreams. Right. So let me just do a quick wrap up. The scene setting from Fabien, of course, was this is an ongoing thing. This is nothing new. It's a continuation of what's been going on, an expansion of what's been going on, but also a review on what has been going on. So a question of making, is it fit for purpose? So I think that's definitely on a positive pathway, which we're on. SFTR, the big thing I think that I took away from the panel was the active client engagement in this, which will shape the business going forward. Now, I made my own comments about whether I think that should be standalone. I don't think it is standalone, but you can make up your own minds. And 10C1, clearly clarity is needed, and an active industry and regulatory engagement will probably happen, but is definitely needed. Other regulations. Look, there's slow globalization of this. So you saw EU, you saw the US, a little bit of Australia, a little bit of Japan, but you can see where regulations are today and where they're coming in the next couple of years. To me, this creates different competitive positions, and so divergence is inevitable as different regions, different countries take different views on what's actually valuable and meaningful, right? And it's no different than maybe even the various Basel banking rules, which might be agreed centrally, but get rolled out at different paces around the world and with locals as well. So there's nothing new about how securities finance regulations are growing or not growing. And then finally, I think Ed made a great comment when they were talking about future regulation. And he said, look, right now it's hard to look past 10C1. That's the most immediate, urgent, pressing issue. And I think that's a good way to summarize the panel. So that's it. Next week, it's probably 49, not 48. I'm going to be looking at 3. I don't know which of the panel or panels that I'll be doing. So as I do my research during the week and review the presentations, I will figure that out. Don't forget, you can always go to on the YouTube channel. I also have a community channel where there's like open free engagement there. If you have any questions or comments on this video or any of the videos, feel free to put them into the video themselves or to discuss it on the community page. That's it for me. I hope you found that useful. I'm Roy Zimmerhansl. What am I? I'm the principal at Pierpoint Financial, and I am out of here. Have a great weekend. See you.